Hi, my name is Lotem Elber-Dorozko. I do philosophy of cognitive science and neuroscience. And my philosophical work is very closely related to scientific practice. And basically it began throughout my PhD, which was in computational neuroscience. So what happened is that during my work in modeling, in stressing computational models for cognitive capacities, a few philosophical questions came up about the methodology in cognitive science, which I've been thinking about ever since. So to give a bit more detail, in the beginning of my PhD, I played with different computational models for decision making and looked at the evidence, the neuronal evidence that we have for neuronal correlates with these different models. And what I found out is that there is this gap between the evidence that we have that's correlational and causal, and between what scientists actually want to discover, which is representation and computation in the brain. We want to suggest good models for how people make decisions, and often when scientists think about these models, they want to say something about what brain activity represents, or what is the computation and information processing that's going on in the brain. The problem is that the type of data that we can get is usually correlational and sometimes causal data. And this data can support very different computational models. And it's not clear how to tell them apart and what we're actually looking for. And sometimes we even see that what scientists will call representation comes apart from the model that has the most empirical support. To give an example, so consider what cells in the eye, what we call neurons in the retina of the eye, represent. So most people will say, most scientists will say, they represent light intensities in specific locations in the retina. But we know also that these neurons will respond when we press the eye, right? So if you go like this, if you press on the eye strong enough, you'll see kind of dots of light or patterns of light. So we take this as evidence that these neurons also respond to pressure on the eye. But if you talk to scientists, no one will say that these neurons represent pressure on the eye, even though we do see that they correlate with this environmental property. So we see that scientists in neuroscience don't only think about neuronal data as evidence and don't only consider these correlational and causal empirical evidence when they think about representations and computations. And the question that has been bothering me since the beginning of my PhD is, so what are they thinking about? Like, what are the considerations that motivate them to say that something is a representation or a computation? So one thing that has come up is the notion of function, or biological function. Philosophers have written a lot about. And the idea is, why do we say that the neurons in the eye don't represent pressure on the eye? We say that because we think that the eye has been adapted for vision, to process information about light intensities. So when we think about what neuronal activity represents, we relate it to the history and the evolutionary history of biological systems. So I think I'm pretty convinced by this idea, but one of the difficulties here is that unlike kind of empirical evidence, correlational data, causal data, there is no obvious way to quantify and to measure evolutionary history, or what we think was an adaptation, or what we think is a biological function. So the result is that it can be very difficult to decide. There's no clear quantitative measure to decide between scientists what's the right what's the right way to define a representation, and what are the right models when they talk about representations. So scientists obviously are able to do this to some extent, although we do see a lot of disagreements. And this is the question that I've been working on this year. What do we do when scientists try to decide according to features that cannot be quantitatively measured? One way I'm doing it is I'm thinking about success stories, both in neuroscience and in biology more generally. How do we identify the function of the heart, the kidneys, etc.? And looking at the history of biology and trying to learn from that how neuroscientists can reach agreement on these questions, which currently they don't agree on. That's it, collaborating with philosophers and neuroscientists on these questions, and I'm excited for this year.